Welcome to Chapter 13, Section 3. We've been looking at statistics that measure how the economy is doing. We did real GDP and poverty rates. We looked at the rate of inflation in the last section. In this section, we want to look at one more statistic that measures how the economy is doing. And it's one of the more famous ones. It's called the unemployment rate. Okay? Obviously, if a country has a lot of unemployed workers, the economy is not doing well. So what does it mean to be unemployed? What is the unemployment rate? Okay. Well, in order to calculate the unemployment rate, the percentage of people that are unemployed, we use this formula, a very straightforward formula. We take the number of unemployed workers and divide it by the civilian labor force. What does it mean to be part of the civilian labor force? Well, civilian means you're not in the military. So we're not going to include all the people that serve in the armed forces. The Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, etc. So those are not included because they're not civilians. In order to be part of the civilian labor force, not in the military, and you have to be at least 16 years of age or older. And this is very important, you either have to already have a job or be actively looking for a job. So all of you are 16 years of age or older, but you're not necessarily part of the labor force because you might not be looking for a job. Okay. The people that are looking for a job and unable to find one, those are what we call unemployed workers because they're actively looking for a job. Okay. When I was growing up, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. She did not have a job, but since she wasn't looking for a job, she wasn't unemployed, even though she didn't have a job. Just like you might not be unemployed because you're not looking for a job. Okay. So we're going to take the number of unemployed Americans divided by the civilian labor force, and that will calculate the unemployment rate. Well, it would be impossible for the government to ask every person, are you unemployed? Are you unemployed? Are you unemployed? Are you unemployed? So what they do is they take a small sample, and they take the data from the small group and project it out on the entire group. For example, if I asked how many of my third period students have started the homework, and I came up with 40%. Well, then I might assume that 40% of all of my students have started the homework. Okay? We take a small group and project it out on the entire group. Okay? So every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys 60,000 households across the entire United States. Okay? And they ask those households how many people are part of the labor force and how many of those are unemployed. That is, they're actively seeking work. Okay? And then from that small group, they project it out on the entire group. Okay? Last month, the most recent statistics that we have, okay, there were 12,580 workers. So we have to add another zero to this, or 3 more zeros to this. So there were over 12 million unemployed Americans, 12.5 million unemployed Americans. The labor force was made up of 143. So there was 160 million Americans who already had a job or were looking for a job. There's the amount that were looking but unable to find it. And this came out to 7.9%. The unemployment rate is currently 7.9%. And that's pretty high. The good news is it's a lot lower than it was a few months ago, and it's been getting lower for the last 5 or 6 months. Okay? The pandemic has caused a great deal of unemployment. In fact, in April, the unemployment rate was almost double this. It was 14.7%. Okay? So the unemployment rate has been going down ever since April. Okay? Hopefully it will continue to go down. Obviously, unemployment is not good. Nobody wants to be out of work. Okay? So the unemployment statistic tries to tell us how things are going in the economy. But the unemployment statistic does not tell the whole story. There are 3 groups of people that do not show up in the unemployment statistic, but that are still experiencing employment issues. Okay? The book calls these forms of underemployment. Underemployment. See if I can get a better pen. The forms of underemployment are situations where people are not going to show up in the unemployment statistic, okay? But they are still experiencing employment issues. For example, a part-time worker. If you work just 1 hour a week, you're considered to be employed. That is, not unemployed. So imagine you had a full-time job and your hours got cut back to 1 hour a week. That would stink, but you would not be considered unemployed because you still had a job for at least 1 hour. Okay? This is what happens during a recession. A lot of people do get laid off. Okay? Talked about how the unemployment went up. But what about all those other people that had full-time hours that are now working only a fraction of those hours so that their pay is being cut? Are they still experiencing economic hardship? Are things still difficult for them? Yes, but they're not showing up in the unemployment statistic because they have a part-time job. There's a lot of Americans like that, millions of Americans, that if you ask them, do you want a full-time job? They'd say, heck yeah, I want a full-time job, but they're not able to get it. The second one is what we call a discouraged worker. A discouraged worker. This is someone who has become so discouraged, so frustrated, that they stop looking for work altogether. But the minute they stop looking, they're technically no longer unemployed. So they're not going to show up in that statistic. Think about the homeless person that you've seen at the end of the freeway off-ramp or on a street corner asking for money. They don't have a job, but they're not technically unemployed because they're not looking. There are hundreds of thousands of these people every month that have become so discouraged that they stop looking. And the minute they stop looking, they're no longer part of the unemployment. If you ask this person, do you want a job? They'd say, yes, 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 I want a job. But because they're not looking, they're no longer unemployed. And then the last group of underemployed, actually not in the book, is the worker that is working below their job skills. For example, I get laid off as a teacher because of the pandemic. I lose my job as a teacher, but I'm able to get a job flipping burgers at McDonald's. Am I unemployed? No, but I'm certainly underemployed because not a lot of people with a college education and 2 master's degrees is going to be flipping burgers at McDonald's. I'm working below my job skills. That's another form of underemployment. These 3 groups of people are not going to show up in the unemployment data. So when we say that 7.9 or 12.5 million Americans are unemployed, that's true. But there's so many more that are underemployed that are not showing up in the statistic because they've been discouraged and they stopped looking, because they're working part-time instead of full-time even though they want a full-time job, or they're working at a job below their job skills. All right, so unemployment is the most commonly used statistic to measure how the economy is doing. But what causes people to lose their jobs? There are 5 types of unemployment. There are 5 types of unemployment. The first type of unemployment is frictional. frictional unemployment is workers that are between jobs. For example, I have a job as a roofer. I put roofs on houses, okay? So I finish one house, and then what? I start looking for another house to do. But in between the time I finish the first house and the time I start roofing the second house, I'm looking for work. I'm said to be frictionally unemployed because I'm between jobs. Okay? I'm an actor or actress. I finish one movie and I start looking for another movie to do. Okay? In between, I'm frictionally unemployed. Okay? Before I started at Charter Oak High School, I had taught at Arroyo High School in El Monte. In between the time I finished at Arroyo and started at Charter Oak in the fall, I was looking for some summer work. I couldn't find any. I was frictionally unemployed. Okay? We're going to skip the next two in the book for a reason. Okay? What is cyclical unemployment? Cyclical unemployment is unemployment that is caused by changes in the business cycle. In other words, when the economy goes into a recession, a lot of people are laid off. Okay? Because of this recession, a lot of people are not getting on airplanes, okay, because of the pandemic and so forth. So a lot of the people in the airline industry are being laid off. Now, hopefully, the pandemic will end eventually and people will start getting back on planes and they'll get their job back. Okay? But a lot of people lose their job when the economy goes into a recession. Okay? The third one is seasonal. With seasonal unemployment, you're unemployed because it's the wrong time of the year. For example, let's say you're a lifeguard at Raging Waters. Okay? Well, what happens during the winter? Raging Waters isn't open, so you're looking for work. You're said to be seasonally unemployed. Okay? Two of my daughters live in Buffalo, New York, where it snows a lot. Maybe you do construction work. Not a lot of construction work is going to get done in the winter, where it's snowing and it's 5 and 10 degrees outside. So if you're a construction worker in Buffalo during the months of December, January, February, March, you might not have any work because of all the snow. So you're seasonally unemployed. The reason I put these three together is because they're temporary. Eventually, your job is coming back. Eventually, you will get your job back. Okay? When the weather changes, when the economy gets better, or when your next job pops up, you're going to get your job back. The two that we skipped over are much more serious because your job is never coming back. What is structural unemployment? With structural unemployment, you're unemployed because there's been a change in the way our economy operates, okay? Such that your job skills are no longer necessary. The thing that you do, we don't need it anymore. Many, many, many years ago, when I started teaching at Charter Oak High School 28 years ago or whatever it was, 27, 28 years ago, I taught typing on an old-fashioned typewriter. Okay? The old typewriters that you've seen in the movies or maybe in a museum. Okay? Well, once a week on Fridays, we had a typewriter repairman come in and fix the typewriters. Because kids bang on the typewriters all week long. So he would come in and he would replace the ribbons, fix the keys and stuff like that. Well, what happened to his job? He lost his job because we don't use typewriters anymore. We use computers. So he became structurally unemployed because we don't need his job skills anymore. We don't need his job skills. His job skills are no longer necessary. Okay? I think the book they talk about with the advent of the automobile. What happened because of the automobile? Well, all the people that used to make buggies or horse carriages, they no longer had a job because people weren't buying those things anymore. They were buying automobiles. Okay? There was a structural change in the way we do things. so that your job is no longer necessary. Outsourcing is a type of structural unemployment. On page 372 in the textbook, they talk about outsourcing. Outsourcing, also in the homework, is when a company sends a particular part of their job to somewhere else. Okay? For example, Mr. Ward's Hamburger Stand, instead of me doing the payroll, I hire another company, I outsource my payroll to another company and they do it for me. Well, then what happens to all the people that did the payroll at my company? They're going to lose their job and it's never coming back. One of the most famous forms of outsourcing is now customer service. If you've ever called customer service for one of your electronic items, maybe your cell phone or your laptop or your television set or anything like that, when you call up customer service, you're probably talking to someone in India or the Philippines. Why are you not talking to an American citizen? It's an American computer, it's an American cell phone. Why are you talking to somebody in the Philippines or in India? Because it's way cheaper. The biggest advantage, this you're going to need for the homework, the biggest advantage to outsourcing is it's cheaper. It's cheaper to pay someone in India or in the Philippines to answer that call. When Mr. Ward says, hey, I'm having trouble with my iPad, a lot easier for me to be talking to someone, a lot cheaper, I should say, for me to be talking to someone in another country where they can pay them way less money. Here in the United States, we'd have to pay them more. So the biggest advantage to outsourcing is that it's cheaper. But the disadvantage is now it's costing us jobs. It cost Americans jobs. Okay? It used to be if you called an American company's customer service, you talked to somebody else in America, and that was a job for an American citizen. But now we're outsourcing it. Okay? And I'm not saying that outsourcing is bad because it makes things cheaper. It makes my laptop cheaper. It makes my cell phone cheaper because now they don't have to spend as much money on customer service, so they can lower the price of my cell phone. They can lower the price of my laptop or my iPad. Okay? But outsourcing is a form of structural unemployment. Those jobs aren't coming back. We're not going to ever go back to paying more money for someone in the United States to answer those phone calls. Okay? The last form of unemployment is similar, and that's technological unemployment. These two forms are permanent. These last two forms, structural and technological unemployment, are much more serious because they're permanent. Okay? With technological unemployment, it's not that your job skills are no longer necessary, it's that your job skills are now being done by a machine. Okay? Way back in the day, when you called Charter Oak High School, there was a real live human being that said, thank you for calling Charter Oak High School. How may I help you? How may I direct your call? Okay? Well, that person is now a machine. Now when you call Charter Oak High School, you get, thank you for calling Charter Oak High School. If you know your party's 5-digit extension, you may enter it at any time. Press 1 for the attendance office. Press 2 for the counseling office. That machine has replaced that human being. The book talks about the ATM machine. Back in the day, before the ATM machine, you had to go inside the bank and talk to a real live human being to get your money out of the bank or to make a deposit at the bank. Now you can do it online. Now you can do it at the ATM machine. And so technology has replaced a lot of workers. And those, we're not going backwards in technology, so those job losses are permanent. These people are never going to get their job back. It's not like when the weather changes, we're going to say, okay, well, I guess we're not going to use computers anymore, or I guess we're not going to use the ATM machine. When the recession ends, people will start using. That's not going to happen. Okay? So your 5 types of unemployment: frictional, the worker that's between jobs; Cyclical, the worker that loses his job or her job because of a recession. Seasonal, because you're unemployed because it's the wrong time of the year. You're a construction worker in the winter or a lifeguard in the summer. I'm sorry, a lifeguard in the winter. Okay? Structural and technological. You lose your job because your job skills are no longer needed. You lose your job because your job is now being done by a machine, like the receptionist or the ATM machine. Okay? Doesn't matter why you're unemployed, it stinks to be unemployed. Because when you're unemployed, you're not going to make any money. How are you going to support yourself and your family? So regardless of the type of unemployment, being unemployed is not good. And the more unemployed people we have, the worse our economy is doing. All right, last thing is on page 372. I'm sorry, 374. Okay. When the economy faces unemployment, when the economy is facing a recession, when the economy is facing inflation, we call these instances of economic instability. The economy is unstable. Okay. And these impact the economy. These last two statistics are not formal statistics. They're not ones that we read about in the newspaper or that the government is calculating, but they are something you want to know. The first is the GDP gap. Here's something from way back in chapter 1. Remember the production possibilities frontier? We can produce our economy if we use all of our resources, every ounce of land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. We can produce anywhere along this curve. But in the real world, we don't make it all the way out to the maximum. We're somewhere inside the maximum because we have unemployed workers. We have factories that are sitting idle and so forth. Well, the distance between what we are making and what we could be making is called our GDP gap. Right now, our GDP is at about $20 trillion, $21 trillion. But if we put all of our workers together, maybe we could be making $25 trillion worth of stuff. And that would be better. So the GDP gap is the distance between what our economy could be producing, the maximum, and what we're actually producing. And of course, we want the GDP gap to be as small as possible. Okay? All right. The other statistic besides the GDP gap is what we call the discomfort or misery index. All they do for the discomfort or misery index is add up the unemployment and inflation rates. The current rate of inflation is about 1.8%. 1.8% is the inflation rate. The unemployment rate is 7.9. Goodness gracious, you'd think I'd have some pens that work. 7.9%. If you add those two together, the inflation rate and the unemployment rate, okay, you get 9.7. And that's just a way of looking at how the economy is doing. Obviously, the higher this number is, the worse the economy is doing because we have too many unemployed workers or because prices are rising too much. And if you look at the chart on page 374, okay, in 1981, when I was a senior in the fall of 1981, the misery index was over almost 23%. That's because the unemployment rate was like 10% and the rate of inflation was 13%. That was terrible. We had a lot of people, 10% of the American people who couldn't find a job, they were unemployed, and the other 90% couldn't afford to buy anything because prices were rising so rapidly. Okay? So as bad as you have it, I had it worse when I was a high school senior. Okay? What do all of these things mean? The unemployment rate, the inflation rate, these instances of economic instability, they're what lead to social and political instability. What causes people to be upset and to revolt? Economic issues. What causes a lot of crime? A lot of crime is traced to economic issues. If I'm poor, I'm going to commit crime so I can have some money. Okay? Drug and alcohol abuse. Okay? Divorce. Almost all of those can be attributed to economic issues. So that's why we need to be worried about our economy. It also impacts our politics. Okay? I'm doing this on the election day. Maybe President Trump is not reelected because people are so worried about all these other things and because the economy is not doing well. All right, so that's the unemployment rate and some other things that go with the unemployment rate, and of course the types of unemployment.